What the hell? Who let you into my garden? The roar cracked through the silence like a whip. Richard Whitehall's voice. There, right in the middle of his manicured lawn, was a filthy little black girl dancing like she owned the place. Her shirt was 3 sizes too big. Her shorts were torn. Her feet caked in dirt. Her hair curled wildly around her frightened eyes. And sitting not 10 feet away, clapping with glee, was Sophie Whitehall, his daughter, his fragile, broken daughter. Richard's heart clenched. Sophie, bound to her wheelchair since the accident nearly a year ago, had barely uttered more than 2 words in weeks. But now she was laughing, eyes bright, body animated, cheeks flushed with color. But Richard didn't see that, at least not yet. "What the hell do you think you're doing here, girl?" he barked, marching toward her. The child stopped, visibly trembling, her shoulders hunched. "Who told you you could set foot on my property?" I'm sorry, sir," she stammered, voice shaking. "I didn't mean no harm. I just saw her. Your daughter." She looked sad. "So I thought, maybe if I danced." "Don't you dare try to talk your way out of this," he snapped. "You filthy little rat. You think this is a circus? You think you can prance around like some clown in my garden, and it's all fine? This is not your playground. This is a private estate. You don't belong here." Tears welled in the girl's eyes. She took a trembling step back. Sophie's voice cried out, "Daddy, stop. Please don't yell at her." But Richard's anger had taken the wheel. He didn't just yell. He humiliated. "I've had enough of this. You want to act like trash? Then maybe that's where you belong." And before anyone could stop him, he barked at the groundskeeper who had come running in confusion. "Get her out of here. Dump her where she came from if you have to." The man hesitated, appalled. "I said throw her out." Under pressure, the man grabbed the girl's arm gently but firmly and began dragging her toward the service path near the garage. A row of trash bins stood open nearby, waiting for pickup. The girl cried out, "Please, I didn't mean anything bad, I just wanted her to smile." Richard turned his back coldly. But Sophie, still sitting near the pond's edge, leaned forward too far in her panic. "No, don't hurt her." Her wheelchair jolted. The front wheels teetered over the edge of the stone path. And just as she began to tip forward toward the shallow koi pond, the little girl broke free. Like lightning, she dashed back, slammed into the side of the wheelchair, and grabbed Sophie's arms with both hands. "Hold on." Sophie's body swayed dangerously, but Tasha held fast, gritting her teeth, pulling the girl back onto the safety of the stone path. The wheelchair rocked, then stabilized. Sophie gasped for air, wide-eyed. Richard turned at the sound, his heart nearly stopping as he saw what had just unfolded. The child, that same girl he had just ordered thrown into the trash, was now panting, still holding onto his daughter's wrists. Their eyes met, his filled with shock, hers filled with something deeper than fear, betrayal. And then she ran. She took off through the garden hedge, disappearing between the gaps like a shadow fleeing a storm. "Sophie!" Richard rushed over. Sophie looked up at him, tears in her eyes. "She saved me, Daddy." Richard stared after the gap in the hedge. His mouth was open, but no words came out. Later that night, the mansion was silent again, too silent. Richard poured himself a whiskey in the dim light of his study and sat before the wall of security monitors. Footage from the garden played back in colorless grayscale. He fast-forwarded to the afternoon timestamp. The girl appeared on screen, slipping through a break in the hedge. She approached Sophie slowly, cautiously, then suddenly exploded into movement. Arms flapping, knees bouncing, feet stamping. A kind of wild, joyful chaos that seemed to rewrite the stillness around her. And Sophie came alive. She clapped, leaned forward, even mimicked the girl's movements with her arms. Richard leaned in closer. There her toes twitched, barely perceptible, but real. He swallowed hard, and then he saw it frame by frame, Sophie tipping forward, the girl lunging back, catching her, saving her. He rewound it 3 times. Then he sat in the dark, elbows on knees, staring at the screen with burning eyes. Then he sat back in his chair and muttered to the empty room, "What have I done?" The next morning, Richard stood by the breakfast table, untouched coffee steaming in front of him. Sophie stared at her cereal, her spoon unmoving. "Sweetheart," he began cautiously, "about yesterday, Will she come back? Sophie interrupted. He paused. Would you like her to? Her eyes lifted slowly. She makes me feel like I can fly, Daddy, even when I can't move. Richard said nothing. His throat felt tight. By mid-afternoon, the mansion's security team received new orders. If the girl returned, she was to be allowed in, no questions, no interference. That evening, as the golden sun stretched long shadows across the garden, Richard stood hidden behind one of the marble columns. Sophie waited in her chair, glancing eagerly toward the hedges. And then there she was, the same girl, the same oversized shirt. She emerged from the foliage like she'd never left, barefoot and smiling cautiously. Sophie's face lit up. You came back? The girl smiled cautiously but didn't move further. Her eyes darted to Richard. He cleared his throat. You have a name? The girl hesitated, then nodded. Tasha. That your first name or your whole name? I think it's just Tasha. No one ever said anything else. He watched her for a beat, then gestured to a stone bench. Come sit. She glanced at Sophie, who nodded enthusiastically. It's okay. He's not mad anymore. Tasha took a few hesitant steps forward, sat lightly on the very edge of the bench as if ready to run. Her knees bounced nervously. Richard studied her thin wrists, dirt under her fingernails, eyes too old for her face. How old are you, Tasha? Maybe 9, she said softly. Maybe 10. You don't know? No birthdays. Not really. One time a lady at the shelter gave me half a cupcake and said happy birthday, but I don't think it was mine. Something inside him twisted. He forced a breath through his nose. And where are you staying? Used to be the bus station. Now there's this old storage unit behind the laundromat. Sometimes a church basement if they don't catch me. He nodded slowly, trying not to let his face show the churn in his stomach. Are you alone? She shrugged. Sometimes other kids, sometimes not. Sophie rolled forward a few inches. She's not bad, Daddy. She saved me. She makes me laugh. You said I haven't laughed in forever, remember? Richard didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked back at Tasha. Do you go to school? Sometimes. Not the same one. Depends where I sleep. And food? Churches. Dumpsters. Sometimes people give me stuff. Sophie gasped. You eat from the garbage? Tasha shrugged again, but this time her eyes dropped. Richard stood, pacing for a moment, then stopped. All right, he said. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to come back here tomorrow. Same time. You'll eat dinner with us. You'll take a bath. We'll find you something that fits. Oh, Tasha's head snapped up. What? You heard me. Why? Because, he said quietly, you gave my daughter something no doctor could. Sophie beamed. He means joy. Richard gave a wry smile. That too. Tasha stared at him, unblinking. You won't yell again? He crouched to her level. I shouldn't have the first time. She nodded once. That evening, the Whitehall household moved to a different rhythm. Mrs. Langford, the longtime housekeeper, blinked in confusion when Richard requested a second-place setting at the kitchen island. For whom, sir? A guest, he said. A little girl named Tasha. Mrs. Langford didn't ask further, but her raised brow spoke volumes. Tasha arrived just before sunset, freshly washed in the guest bathroom, wearing one of Sophie's old t-shirts that still hung awkwardly on her bony frame. Her hair had been gently brushed by Sophie herself, each knot untangled with care and laughter. They ate fried chicken and mashed potatoes, and Richard listened as Sophie talked more than she had in months. She described her favorite books, her imaginary dog, the color she wanted to paint her room. And when Tasha shared a story about once pretending to be a statue to avoid being seen by a night guard, Sophie laughed so hard she nearly knocked over her milk. After dinner, the girls played cards in the sunroom. Richard stood just outside, listening. Your house is like a hotel, Tasha whispered. No, Sophie said. Hotels don't feel this warm. That night, Richard lingered in the doorway of Sophie's room. She was already asleep, her chest rising and falling evenly. One hand curled beside her cheek. He turned off the lamp, then paused outside the guest room. Tasha was curled up on top of the blankets, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. You all right? He asked. She nodded. It's too quiet. He offered a small smile. You'll get used to it. She looked over at him, her voice barely above a breath. Thanks for not throwing me out again. He nodded. throat tight. Thanks for coming back. As he walked back to his room, a memory flashed, his late wife's voice echoing from years ago. You can buy the whole world, Richard. But it won't matter if your daughter can't laugh. He closed his eyes. Now, she laughed, because of a little barefoot girl with no name and no birthday. Hope, he thought, might come from the strangest places. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and comment where you're watching from. You might just find someone nearby watching too. The next morning, Richard Whitehall found himself staring at a breakfast table he had barely touched in months. Scrambled eggs, toast with peach jam, hot black coffee, every item in front of him carefully prepared by Mrs. Langford, yet untouched. Across the table, Sophie hummed to herself, spooning cereal into her mouth with more energy than he had seen in over a year. And beside her sat Tasha, still barefoot, still cautious, still slightly hunched in posture like she was bracing for something to go wrong. Richard sipped his coffee slowly and cleared his throat. We're going shopping today. Sophie looked up, milk mustache under her nose. For what? Tasha needs shoes. The girl stiffened immediately. I don't need nothing, sir. I'm okay like this. No, you're not, Richard replied gently but firmly. You need shoes, and clothes that fit, and a backpack, and probably glasses. Sophie clapped. Can we go to Parker's? That place has the sparkly shoes I love. Tasha shook her head quickly. I can't go in those stores. They'll look at me. Then let them look, Richard said, standing. If anyone says a word, they'll deal with me. Meh. An hour later, they were inside Parker's family department store. A clean, well-lit chain shop nestled in the historic district of Charleston. People turned as they entered. Richard Whitehall was recognizable, of course, the billionaire philanthropist with the tragic past and stoic face. Beside him, his daughter rolled along in her polished wheelchair, and beside her, a skinny black girl in an oversized t-shirt and borrowed jeans that didn't quite reach her ankles. The glances weren't cruel, but they weren't kind either. Tasha felt them burn into her skin. She clung to Sophie's chair like a raft. Is it always like this? She whispered. Sophie looked up at her. For me, sometimes. But you get used to it. Daddy says rich people stare when they don't know how to talk. Tasha giggled despite herself. They stopped in front of the kids' shoe section. Sophie immediately rolled toward the glittery display of pink sneakers with rainbow soles. These would be perfect for you. Tasha's eyes lit up, but then dimmed again. They look expensive. Richard turned toward the sales associate. Size 3, try them both. The girl hesitated. Really? You saved my daughter's life. That's worth at least a pair of shoes. She slid her feet in slowly, as if the shoes might vanish the moment she touched them. The soles bounced when she stood. Her heels sunk into the cushioning like she had stepped onto clouds. Tasha stared at her reflection in the mirror. I've never owned shoes like this, she murmured. Richard observed the way she wiggled her toes. He'd seen billion-dollar contracts signed with less reverence. They bought 2 more pairs, sensible sneakers and sandals, plus a set of clothes, undergarments, even a soft zip-up hoodie that Sophie insisted matched hers. On the ride home, Tasha sat quietly in the back seat, her eyes glued to the trees zipping past. Richard glanced at her through the rearview mirror. You okay back there? She didn't answer right away. Then softly, when I was little, I used to pretend someone was out there who cared about me. Like maybe someone just didn't know I was missing. Richard's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. Sophie looked at her. Maybe they didn't know, but now they do. Tasha blinked quickly and nodded. Yeah. That afternoon, the girls played in the garden again. Sophie drew chalk stars on the stone path. Tasha danced around her, jumping from one constellation to the next like it was a galactic hopscotch. Richard watched from a distance, an open book forgotten in his lap. At one point, Tasha spun too quickly and fell onto the grass, laughing. Sophie laughed too, high and free, and then said something that made Richard's heart stop. You feel like my sister. The laughter stopped. Tasha looked at her, stunned. Really? She asked. Sophie shrugged. I never had one, but if I did, I'd want her to be like you. Tasha looked away, wiping her nose with the sleeve of her new hoodie. Nobody's ever said that to me. From the patio, Richard's voice drifted in. Then it's about time someone did. That night, Mrs. Langford made a pot roast with rosemary potatoes. The kitchen filled with warmth and the clink of silverware, like a family long separated trying to remember how to eat together. "Do you like it?" the housekeeper asked, sliding a slice of cornbread onto Tasha's plate. "Yes, ma'am," Tasha said quickly. "It's amazing. You don't have to call me ma'am, sweetheart. I'm not the Queen of England." Tasha grinned. "Okay, Miss Langford?" The old woman smiled. "That'll do just fine." After dinner, Richard received a call from Dr. Albright, Sophie's physical therapist. "I heard from Langford that Sophie's been moving more. Is that true?" "Yes," Richard replied, glancing toward the sunroom where the girls were playing. "She's engaging, smiling, moving her arms freely. I saw her twitch her toes the other day." There was a pause on the line. "That kind of emotional response, it's critical. Whatever's happening, don't stop it." "I wasn't planning to," Richard said. Before bed, he stopped by the guest room. Tasha was standing by the window, looking out into the moonlit garden, her hands in the pockets of her hoodie. "You tired?" he asked. She turned, her face unreadable. "Kind of. Big day." She nodded. "Can I ask something?" "Of course. Why are you being nice to me now? You hated me the first time." Richard exhaled slowly, stepped inside, and leaned against the doorframe. "Because I judged you before I knew you. Because I let fear and pride speak louder than truth." She tilted her head. "Do you still think I'm trash?" His voice cracked. "No, I think you're a gift I almost threw away." She swallowed hard. Then quietly, "Thanks for the shoes." He smiled. "Thanks for saving my daughter." Tasha crawled under the covers, curling up like a kitten finally allowed on the couch. Richard turned off the light and stepped into the hall. And for the first time in years, the house didn't feel haunted by what had been lost. It felt full. Richard Whitehall adjusted the cuffs of his shirt as he stepped onto the front porch, morning coffee in hand. The sun had just crested over the rooftops of Charleston's historic district, casting gold across the dew-covered hedges. From somewhere inside, Sophie's laughter rang out, followed closely by a familiar, lighter voice, Tasha's. It had been just over a week since the girl first slipped through the hedge, barefoot and wild, into their lives. And everything had changed. Richard sipped the coffee slowly, trying to shake the strange heaviness that had settled in his chest. Not unpleasant. Just unfamiliar. Like carrying a full heart in a space that had grown too used to being hollow. "Morning, Mr. Whitehall," came a voice from the street. He turned to find Marjorie Winthrop, his longtime neighbor, power walking past with her Yorkshire Terrier trotting along beside her. Her smile was tight, polite, but her eyes gleamed with curiosity. "Morning, Marjorie," Richard replied flatly. "Lovely weather," she said, slowing down. "Saw you had guests over lately." Richard's brow ticked. "Guests? Well, just wondering," she said with a soft chuckle. "There's been talk. Some of the ladies from the Historical Society noticed a young girl around. A friend of Sophie's." "Is she?" "She is," Richard said, his tone clipped. Marjorie leaned in slightly, as if delivering a secret. "She's not from around here, is she?" "She's a child," Richard replied coldly. "And a good one." Marjorie blinked, caught off guard, then smiled with tight lips. "Well, as long as you know what's best, Richard. Would hate for your generosity to be misunderstood." As she walked away, Richard stared down at the rippling coffee in his mug, the warmth turning bitter in his palm. Inside, Sophie and Tasha were already in the sunroom, surrounded by sketchbooks, colored pencils, and paper snowflakes taped to the windows. Sophie was telling Tasha about the constellations they had drawn on the patio the night before. "See that one?" Sophie pointed to a jagged scribble. "That's Pegasus, the flying horse." "It looks more like a chicken," Tasha laughed. "Maybe it's a flying chicken," Sophie replied with a grin. Richard stepped into the doorway. "Ladies, I have an announcement." Both girls looked up. "We're going out today. Lunch at Market Street, then the library. Sophie, I thought you'd like to show Tasha the children's wing." Sophie gasped. "With the giant beanbags?" Richard nodded. Tasha hesitated. "Are you sure? I mean, is it okay?" "You belong with us," he said simply. "So yes, it's okay." An hour later, They arrived downtown. Charleston bustled with early spring tourists, and the sidewalks shimmered with light off the cobblestones. They had lunch at a shaded outdoor cafe, grilled cheese for the girls, shrimp and grits for Richard. A server, young and well-meaning, raised an eyebrow at Tasha when taking the order, then smiled politely as Richard placed a firm hand on her shoulder. The message was clear. She's with me. At the library, Sophie led the way like a tiny general, directing Tasha to her favorite corner with the soft rugs and picture books. Tasha stood quietly, taking it all in. Books, hundreds of them, lined the walls like treasure chests waiting to be opened. "I can read some," she whispered. "Not a lot." "We'll teach you," Sophie replied, already pulling a book about space from the shelf. They curled into a beanbag, Sophie reading slowly, Tasha following along with her finger. Occasionally, Sophie would stop to explain a word. Sometimes, Tasha would guess what came next. Richard watched from a distance, hand resting on the back of a wooden chair. It wasn't just friendship blooming. It was a quiet act of rebuilding. Later that afternoon, as they walked to the parking lot, they passed a trio of women seated outside a tea shop. One of them nudged another and whispered something, then laughed, too loudly. Tasha's head dipped. She moved slightly behind Richard's leg. He heard the laughter, felt the sharpness behind it. He turned to look at them directly. Their smiles faltered. He didn't say a word, but he didn't have to. That evening, back at the mansion, Richard called in Mrs. Langford. "I want to add Tasha to the household record," he said. "She'll need a room, clothing allowance, medical support, the works." The old woman paused. "Is this permanent, sir?" Richard met her chaza. "As permanent as it gets." Mrs. Langford softened, then nodded. "Good. That girl deserves better." He turned to leave, then added, "And please don't let anyone else in this neighborhood forget it." Later, Richard stood on the back porch, watching the girls through the glass. Sophie was drawing again, this time sketching Tasha in her new hoodie, arms outstretched like wings. Tasha was trying to stand still, but kept giggling. The porch light clicked on as dusk settled. He thought about Marjorie. He thought about the laughter outside the tea shop. He thought about the way Sophie had said, "You feel like my sister." He wasn't just fighting for a little girl anymore. He was fighting for a truth that people like him had been too proud or too blind to see. Some people didn't need saving. They just needed a chance to be seen. The garden that evening buzzed softly with the sounds of spring crickets in the hedges, the low hum of cicadas, and the occasional distant bark of a dog. Richard sat alone on the back patio, a bourbon glass in one hand, untouched. The scent of freshly mowed grass still lingered in the air. Beyond the columns, just past the mosaic-tiled fountain, Sophie and Tasha were chasing fireflies. Sophie wheeled herself forward in quick spurts, giggling as she reached out clumsily toward the glowing dots. Tasha darted beside her, her fingers nimble and fast. They moved together like music and lyrics, one gliding, the other dancing. Richard smiled faintly, the kind of smile that came from watching something unfold that you didn't orchestrate, couldn't buy, and didn't expect but knew was sacred. Mrs. Langford appeared quietly beside him with a tray of lemonade and cookies. "Evening snack," she said. "For the girls. And perhaps for the man who's been pacing the house since lunch." He raised an eyebrow. "Pacing? Sir, you put more miles on that rug than any horse on a racetrack." He chuckled, then sobered. "People are starting to talk." "They always do," she replied evenly. "You just never used to care." Richard nodded. "That girl. She's bringing something out of Sophie that none of the experts could. But the neighbors, Marjorie, the historical society, they don't see that. They see a street kid trespassing." Mrs. Langford folded her arms, then let them talk. "That child's heart is cleaner than half the linen in this house." Richard looked out again. Tasha had just opened her palms to reveal a firefly to Sophie, who squealed as it crawled up her finger. The joy on their faces wasn't performative. It wasn't coaxed. It was just life. "I never realized how empty this place had become," he murmured, "until she filled it." "Your wife would have liked her," Langford added, her voice suddenly softer. "She always believed love didn't come from blood, it came from choice." Richard looked down. "I'm starting to believe that too." Low, out in the yard, Tasha suddenly froze. Her head snapped toward the fence near the side gate. She squinted, eyes narrowing. "What is it?" Sophie asked, concerned. Tasha didn't answer immediately. Then, "There's someone there." Richard stood instantly, his senses sharpening. He crossed the patio quickly and descended the steps, following Tasha's gaze. Near the far corner, partially hidden in the shadows, was a figure. A teenager, maybe 16 or 17, in a ragged hoodie, slouched near the fence line. Tasha stepped in front of Sophie, instinctively protective. Richard walked straight toward the intruder. "You're on private property," he said, voice cool but controlled. The figure flinched, stepping back. "I wasn't gonna steal nothin'," the teen muttered. "I was just lookin'. That girl Tasha, she used to sleep behind the station with us." Richard stopped short. "You know her?" "Yeah," the teen said. "Name's Darian. She kept the rats away with stories." Tasha blinked. "Darian?" He nodded. "Didn't think you'd end up here. In a mansion. Figured you ran." Richard turned to Tasha. "He a friend?" She nodded slowly. "We used to share crackers sometimes. He gave me a scarf once when it snowed." Richard assessed Darian again. Filthy sneakers, a stitched-up jacket, and eyes that had seen more than any child should. "You hungry?" he asked. Darian looked confused. "What?" "I asked if you're hungry." Darian hesitated, then shrugged. "Always." Richard sighed. "Come through the gate. Use the path. We'll feed you. But no sneaking. You sneak again, you're gone." Tasha watched in disbelief as the boy nodded and disappeared around the fence. Sophie looked up at her dad. "Are you making more room?" He looked down at her. "Sometimes a house just needs expanding." Oh, that night, Darian sat at the breakfast nook, devouring leftover meatloaf while Tasha told him about books and chalk constellations. Sophie chimed in with commentary, adding flourishes to every detail. Richard watched them, a strange, beautiful ache settling in his chest. Later, after the kids were in their rooms, Richard stood again in the doorway of Sophie's bedroom. She was half asleep, holding a sketchbook against her chest. "She's drawing us a family," she mumbled. He walked down the hall, pausing at the guest room. Tasha wasn't in bed. She was on the floor, curled up in the corner, blanket barely over her shoulder. Richard stepped inside. "Tasha?" She stirred. "Sorry. Didn't want to mess up the bed." He crouched beside her. "It's your bed now. You belong in it." She looked up, eyes cautious. "Even if I got friends who are still out there?" she asked. Richard nodded. "Especially then." She nodded once, then crawled up into the bed slowly. "I can't pay you back, you know," she whispered. "You already have," he said. As he turned out the light, he caught sight of the sketchbook Sophie had left on the kitchen counter. On it was a crayon drawing 3 figures under a yellow sundae, one in a wheelchair, one dancing barefoot, and one tall man holding both their hands. The caption said, in Sophie's handwriting, "The garden saved us." The morning sun filtered through the stained glass panels in the upstairs hallway, scattering pale pinks and blues across the hardwood floor. Richard Whitehall stepped carefully over one of Sophie's sketchbooks that had been left outside her room, his eyes still blurry from sleep. He could hear faint giggles and the occasional thump of hurried feet downstairs. He paused at the top of the stairs, hand gripping the railing. His house used to be quiet. Now, it pulsed with life. By the time he reached the kitchen, Sophie was already halfway through her waffles, syrup on her chin, while Tasha and Darian hovered by the fridge arguing over whether orange juice or chocolate milk was the superior breakfast drink. "Morning, Daddy," Sophie beamed. "Morning, sweetheart." Richard gave her a kiss on the forehead and turned toward the others. "Did anyone actually sleep last night?" Darian smirked. "Sophie snores." "I do not." You snore when you're happy," Tasha added, giggling. Richard chuckled as he poured himself a cup of coffee. But before he could take a sip, Mrs. Langford appeared at the side door, holding a crisp white envelope. "This just arrived, sir," marked urgent. Richard took the envelope, noting the seal in the corner, Charleston County Child Services. His stomach dropped. He stepped out onto the porch to read it alone. The letter was short and formal, but the message was clear. A report had been filed regarding the presence of a minor, Tasha Green, residing without legal guardianship on the Whitehall property. A home visit would be conducted within 72 hours. Custody status must be addressed. Richard stared at the page as the air around him seemed to shrink. His hands tightened around the letter, the crease deepening between his brows. Inside, laughter continued, but he stood frozen. Later that afternoon, while Sophie napped and Darian was helping Langford fold linens, Richard found Tasha in the garden, sitting quietly on the swing beneath the oak tree. Her new shoes were untied, toes scuffed from playing. She looked up as he approached. "You mad?" "No," he said, sitting on the swing beside hers, "but we need to talk." She nodded slowly. "Someone found out, huh?" "Yes. Are they going to take me?" Richard looked away for a long moment. "They might try." "No." She didn't cry. She didn't beg. Instead, she asked, "Do I get a say?" "Not really," he admitted. "Not unless." He hesitated. "Unless I fight for you." She turned toward him sharply. "You'd do that?" "I'd do that," he said. Tasha sat in silence, gripping the chains of the swing, her feet dragging a slow line through the dirt beneath her. "My mom left me outside a laundromat when I was 4, she said suddenly. She said she'd come back. She never did. Richard didn't interrupt. "I waited 3 nights, she continued, voice flat. "After that, I just figured I must not be worth coming back for." He felt something crack in his chest. "You're worth everything," he said quietly. She sniffed, nodded once, and didn't speak again. The next morning, Richard sat at his office desk with a legal pad, laptop, and phone. The city skyline stretched in soft hues beyond the window, but his focus was laser sharp. He had built empires, negotiated 8-figure contracts, and battled billionaires in boardrooms. This would be the fight of his life. He called his lawyer, David Trent, a former litigator turned children's advocate. "Richard, it's a mess," Trent said after hearing the situation. "No birth certificate, no legal guardian, no record of schooling. The state will call her stateless. That's hard to fight. I'm not asking for a loophole, I'm asking for a path." There was a pause. "You'd have to file for emergency guardianship," Trent said slowly. "Petition the court for placement in your home as a legal ward." "Done." "Richard, this isn't adopting a dog from the shelter. It's red tape, home inspections, character reviews. It could get ugly." "I don't care," Richard said. "Do the paperwork." "Understood." Richard hung up and leaned back, closing his eyes. Then he heard soft knocking. He looked up. Tasha stood at the door. "I heard," she said. "I'm handling it." "Meant." She hesitated. I don't want Sophie to get in trouble." "She won't." "You sure?" He nodded. "This is my choice. Mine. You didn't trick me into it. You didn't ask. I saw the truth. And now, I'm doing what's right." Tasha looked down. "I've never had someone fight for me." "Well," he said, standing, "get used to it." That evening, as the girls watched an old animated movie in the sunroom and Darian played cards with Langford in the kitchen, Richard stepped outside into the garden. The stars were out, not the brilliant sweep of constellations from countryside skies, but soft specks above the city. He remembered the night his wife died. The sky had looked almost the same. Back then, silence had felt permanent. Now, laughter flowed like music from the house behind him. He sat on the garden bench, the one Sophie used to avoid, and stared up. Inside, he heard Tasha say something. Then Sophie's voice rang out clear, full of joy. "He's not just my dad. He's kind of everybody's dad now." And Richard Whitehall, once a man made of marble and metal, smiled into the starlight. The paperwork might take weeks. The court might object, but his mind was already made up. They were a family now, and families, real ones, don't let go. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 a.m. Richard Whitehall was already standing in the foyer, dressed in a navy suit that struck the balance between power and humility. He took a deep breath before opening the door to reveal a woman in her mid-50s gray suit. Clipboard, the unmistakable badge of the South Carolina Department of Child Services pinned to her lapel. "Mr. Whitehall?" she asked, her voice clipped, professional. "Yes," he replied. "Please come in." She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the marble floors, vaulted ceilings, and original oil paintings lining the walls. "I'm Miss Elaine Porter. I'm conducting the emergency home evaluation for Tasha Green." "Of course," Richard said. "Would you like coffee?" "No, thank you. I'd like to speak to Tasha first, if she's available." Richard nodded. "She's in the garden with my daughter." He led her through the hallway, past the library and conservatory, out onto the stone steps that overlooked the garden. There, under the large oak tree, Sophie sat in her wheelchair reading aloud from a children's book, while Tasha lay on her stomach on a blanket, propped up on her elbows, eyes wide with attention. Richard called gently, "Tasha?" She looked up and immediately noticed the woman beside him. Her smile vanished. She sat up, legs folded under her. Sophie looked between them. "Is that a teacher?" "No, sweetheart," Richard said. "This is Miss Porter. She's from the state. She just wants to talk." "No." Tasha nodded once, but Richard could see her arms stiffen. Porter stepped forward, crouching down so she was eye level. "Tasha, it's nice to meet you. Mind if we talk over there in the gazebo?" Tasha stood silently, then walked beside her without a word. Sophie frowned and watched them go, her eyes filled with questions. Richard remained where he was, resisting the urge to follow. In the gazebo, Miss Porter opened her clipboard. "You've been staying here for how long now?" "Almost 2 weeks. Has anyone hurt you, pressured you, forced you to stay?" Tasha looked confused. "No. They gave me food. A room. I have shoes now." Miss Porter nodded. "That's good. And before this, where were you living?" "Behind the laundromat, sometimes the bus station." "Do you know your birthday?" "No, ma'am." "Do you know your parents' names?" Tasha's lips tightened. "No. My mom left me. She said she'd come back, but she didn't." "Men," Miss Porter's pen slowed. "Has Mr. Whitehall told you what he plans to do?" "He said he'd fight for me." Her voice cracked slightly. "He said he wants me to stay." Porter looked up from her clipboard, her face neutral, but something in her eyes had softened. She stood. "Thank you, Tasha. That was very helpful." When they returned to the patio, Sophie rolled forward immediately. "Can she stay, please?" Porter didn't answer the girl, only smiled politely and said, "I'll speak with your father now." Inside the study, Richard closed the door behind them. "Let me be direct," Porter said, taking a seat. "This case is unusual. You have no legal relationship to the child, no documentation, no social worker oversight. And yet, she's been living here, unsupervised." "She's supervised every hour of the day," Richard replied. "By me, my staff, my daughter. Now, she's not your responsibility, Mr. Whitehall." Richard sat down across from her. "No, but she's become part of my family." Porter raised an eyebrow. "Why her?" He didn't hesitate. "Because she saved my daughter's life. Not just physically, emotionally. My child hadn't laughed in 10 months. Then Tasha danced into our yard and gave her hope. That's not charity. That's not obligation. That's grace." Porter studied him for a long moment. "You know what happens to girls like her in the system, Mr. Whitehall?" "I do. They vanish. I won't let that happen." She nodded slowly, then pulled out a form. "Emergency guardianship hearing is scheduled for 2 weeks from today. Until then, she stays here under review. I'll be back in 7 days for a follow-up." "Understood." Porter stood and extended a hand. "Good luck, Mr. Whitehall." He shook it firmly. "Thank you for doing your job." After she left, Richard returned to the garden. Sophie and Tasha were sitting cross-legged under the tree now, drawing faces in the dirt with sticks. He stood watching them for a moment. Then Tasha looked up. "Is she taking me?" "No," Richard said. "Not yet, and not if I can help it." Tasha bit her lip. "What if they say I can't stay?" Richard crouched beside her. "Then I'll fight harder." She nodded, but her eyes shimmered with fear. Later that night, Richard sat at the piano in the music room, an instrument he hadn't touched since his wife passed. His fingers hovered above the keys, unsure, rusty. He played a single note, then another. Soon, a melody formed, slow, uneven, but real. Tasha appeared at the door, quiet as a shadow. "That's pretty," she said. "It used to be," he replied, still playing. "It will be again." "Like us?" she asked. He looked over at her. "Yes," he said, "just like us." A late spring breeze drifted through the garden, rustling the ivy that clung to the outer walls of the Whitehall estate. The sun was beginning to dip, casting a golden hue over the patio stones. Sophie was drawing again, her sketchpad resting on her knees, tongue between her teeth in concentration. Tasha sat cross-legged beside her, sorting through a small box of broken crayons and colored pencils. "Why do you always draw people without shoes?" Sophie asked suddenly, glancing at Tasha's latest picture, a figure standing barefoot in front of a swing set. Tasha looked down at the sketch. "Because that's how I remember them," she said with a shrug. "Everyone I knew didn't have shoes most of the time. And if they did, they were too small or full of holes." Sophie nodded solemnly, as if processing a truth she'd never imagined. Then she handed Tasha a fresh, unbroken blue crayon. "Here," she said. "Use this one. It's brand new." Tasha hesitated. "It's yours." "Now it's yours too." They smiled at each other. Inside the house, Richard stood at the kitchen island, speaking quietly on the phone. David Trent's voice was sharp and fast on the other end. "She'll be back in 6 days, the lawyer said. "And this next visit? It's the one that matters. Child Services will be bringing an external observer, neutral, but influential. If they don't see legal structure, emotional stability, academic support, they'll recommend removing her." Richard's grip tightened around his coffee mug. "She has all of that here. I know that. You know that. But the state wants it documented. I'm getting her enrolled in tutoring tomorrow, and I've scheduled a full checkup with Dr. Harding." "Good. You'll also need letters of character, maybe from staff, neighbors." Richard paused. "Neighbors won't be helpful." "No, then go higher," David said. "Pull whatever strings you've got, because if they file an objection, you'll lose custody, and she'll go back into the system." Richard hung up and stared out the window. Tasha was now pushing Sophie slowly down the garden path in her wheelchair, both of them laughing. He had built billion-dollar companies from the ground up. But this was the only thing that ever truly scared him. He had something to lose. That night at dinner, he cleared his throat and made an announcement. "Starting tomorrow, we're doing a few things to get ready for the next visit. Sophie, I've arranged for a private tutor to come in the afternoons." Sophie groaned. "School during summer?" Richard smiled. "Just a little. And Tasha, you'll have sessions too." Tasha blinked. "But I don't really read good. That's why we'll fix that." She looked down at her plate. "I don't want to mess it up." "You won't," he said. "And you're not alone." The next afternoon, Miss Collins arrived, a retired third-grade teacher with a salt and pepper braid and sensible shoes. She set up her tutoring materials at the kitchen table and immediately went to work assessing both girls. "Tasha's got strong retention," she reported to Richard later. "Her reading level is low, but her mind isn't. She learns fast. Give me time, and she'll be caught up before Labor Day." "She'll have it," Richard replied, "and anything else she needs." The next few days became a gentle rhythm of lessons, laughter, and long walks through the garden. Tasha grew bolder with each passing morning, reading street signs aloud, memorizing poems with Sophie, and even helping Mrs. Langford bake cookies, measuring out ingredients by sounding out the words on the bag. Darian, too, began to change. He stayed out of trouble, read comic books in the sunroom, and asked if he could help wash Richard's car just to earn a few bucks. One evening, as Richard and Langford sat reviewing paperwork in the study, the older woman looked up from the guardianship folder. "You're doing more than just providing, sir," she said. "You're building." He looked at her. "Building what?" "A family." He said nothing, but her words echoed in the back of his mind. Later that night, he found Tasha on the back porch, staring out into the garden. Her sketchpad rested beside her. On the page was a drawing of the estate, stylized and playful, but this time, with 3 children and a man in a tie standing under the sundae. "Can't sleep?" he asked. She shrugged. "Sometimes I stay up to make sure I don't dream all this and wake up back in the alley." Richard sat beside her. "You're not dreaming." Tasha traced the corner of the page with her finger. "Miss Collins asked me today what I want to be when I grow up." He smiled. "What did you say?" "I didn't know how to answer," she whispered. "I never thought I'd get the chance to grow up." He looked at her, then really looked at her, and it struck him how much strength there was behind those tired eyes, how much will had kept her going. "You'll grow up here," he said. "Safe, strong, loved." Her voice cracked. "You promise?" "I do." She leaned her head against his shoulder. And for a moment, there were no legal documents, no court systems, no scrutiny, just two people, under a porch light, trusting in something fragile and real. Family. The mailbox at the end of the gravel driveway was one of those old cast-iron types with a lion's head carved into the side, a leftover from a time when Richard Whitehall cared about appearances more than people. Now it clanked open with a rusty groan as he pulled out a small stack of envelopes, most of them bills or promotional flyers. One, however, was different. Handwritten. No return address. The envelope was addressed simply to the girl named Tasha, who lives in the big house now. Richard turned it over in his hands, frowning. The handwriting was messy, the ink smudged. He walked back up the driveway, the letter gripped tightly between his fingers. In the kitchen, Tasha was helping Mrs. Langford slice strawberries. Her cheeks were dusted with powdered sugar, and there was a dab of flour on her nose. She was laughing at something Darian had said, while Sophie sat at the table, licking whipped cream from her spoon. Richard held up the envelope. "Tasha," he said, "this is for you." She blinked, drying her hands on her apron. "Me?" He handed it to her. No return address. But it's handwritten. Tasha stared at the envelope as if it might burn her. She touched the paper carefully, then looked up at him. "Can I open it here?" "Of course," Richard said, pulling out a chair. She slid her finger under the flap and opened it slowly. Inside was a piece of notebook paper, folded twice. She unfolded it, eyes scanning the page, her lips moving silently with each word. Then her hands started to shake. Richard leaned forward. "Tasha?" She didn't answer right away. Then she whispered, "It's from my mom." The room went still. "Mrs." Langford froze, her knife hovering above a strawberry. Sophie stopped mid-lick. Darian set his fork down slowly. Tasha read aloud, her voice trembling. "Tasha, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I heard from someone that you ended up in some big house. That you're safe now. I hope that's true. I'm sorry I left you. I was sick, and I was scared, and I didn't know how to be your mom. I was young and stupid, but I never stopped thinking about you. I hope someday you'll forgive me. I hope you're loved. That's all I ever wanted for you. M." She lowered the paper, eyes glassy. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Sophie reached over and took her hand. Richard leaned in. "Do you want to talk about it?" Tasha shook her head. He nodded. "All right. But if you do, we're here." She folded the letter neatly and held it to her chest. That afternoon, she disappeared into the garden, sitting alone under the willow tree with the letter beside her. Richard watched from the library window but didn't follow. She needed space. Eventually, Sophie wheeled herself out and joined her. "I didn't cry when she left me," Tasha said. Sophie didn't say anything. She just waited. "I kept telling myself she'd come back, even when I got hungry, even when it got cold." Sophie leaned over and rested her hand on Tasha's knee. "But she didn't come back," Tasha whispered. "Not really. A letter's not the same." "No," Sophie said. "But maybe it's a start." They sat quietly after that, the willow branches swaying above them like curtain threads. That night, Richard found Tasha sitting on the stairs, holding the letter again. "I think part of me wanted her to stay gone," she said, "because it hurt less when I thought she just didn't care." He sat down beside her. "And now? Now it's messier, but I guess real things usually are." He nodded. "Sometimes people do unforgivable things and still hope for forgiveness. Sometimes it takes more strength to let someone back into your heart than to keep them out." Tasha looked at him. "Are you mad she wrote me?" "No," Richard said. "I'm glad you know the truth, even if it hurts." She nodded and leaned her head on his shoulder. "You feel more like my dad than she ever felt like my mom." He placed a hand gently on her back. "And you feel more like my daughter than I ever thought I'd have again." The next morning, Tasha folded the letter and placed it in a small wooden box. Sophie had given her a jewelry box with a broken clasp but a soft velvet interior. She tucked it beneath her bed, not as a shrine, not as a wound, but as a chapter, one of many. The late afternoon sun settled lazily over the garden as the girls traced imaginary borders in the soil with sticks. Tasha was outlining a large rectangle next to the patio, declaring it her territory, while Sophie drew swirls inside and insisted it was now magical land. Darian, sitting on the stone steps with a comic book folded over his knees, looked up. "You know that's not how borders work, right? Tasha smirked. In this kingdom, we make the rules. Sophie laughed. Exactly. Tasha is queen, and I'm the magical sorceress. Darian rolled his eyes but smiled. Cool. Can I be the knight who doesn't follow orders? You already are, Tasha shot back. Inside, Richard was finishing a call with David Trent. The lawyer's tone was steady, but urgency laced his words. They're sending the observer early, David said. 2 days from now instead of 4. Some pressure from upstairs, apparently. Maybe someone raised concerns. Richard stood still. Concerns? David paused. I don't know if this is connected, but I heard a rumor your neighbor Marjorie Winthrop submitted a quiet complaint. Something about unknown persons living on the premises. Could be nothing. But be ready. Richard's jaw clenched. I'll be ready. After the call, he sat at his desk, rereading the character reference he'd written himself. Clean, direct, unemotional. It felt wrong, so he crumpled it and started again. This time, he wrote from the heart. When Tasha came into my life, I was prepared to send her away. I saw her as a problem, not a person. But then I saw something else. I saw my daughter laugh again. I saw joy return to a house that had become a tomb. I saw a child who had every reason to give up choose to hope instead. He signed it with conviction. Later that evening, he sat down with the children around the dinner table. Tasha was quieter than usual, pushing her peas around with her fork. Everything all right? He asked. She nodded but didn't meet his eyes. Sophie answered for her. She's nervous. Tasha sighed. What if I say the wrong thing when that lady comes? You won't, Richard said. Just be yourself. But what if that's not good enough? He reached across the table and gently tapped the side of her plate. Tasha, you being you is the reason we're even here. I wouldn't fight this hard for someone who wasn't already enough. She blinked at him, swallowing hard. And besides, he added, we've got a plan. Sophie's eyes widened. We do? Yes. Tomorrow, we rehearse. Questions, answers, everything. We make sure everyone feels ready. Like a play? Tasha asked. Exactly like a play, and you two are the stars. Darian grinned. Then I get to be the director. Only if you don't yell, Sophie said. He raised his hands. Promise. Silent director. The next morning, Richard gathered them all in the sunroom. Mrs. Langford played the role of the observer, clipboard and all, wearing her reading glasses low on her nose. Name? She barked in mock authority at Tasha. Tasha Green. Age? About 9. What's your favorite book? Anything with dragons or dancing? Sophie whispered. Say the one we read together. Right, The Paper Bag Princess. Mrs. Langford nodded, then turned to Sophie. And you, young lady? I use a wheelchair, but that doesn't mean I don't run this house. Mess. Everyone burst into laughter, including Langford, who gave a theatrical sigh and scribbled on her pretend clipboard. Approved. Tasha Biamed. Richard stood back, watching it all with pride. The way Tasha held herself. The way Darian encouraged her. The way Sophie filled the room with joy that was once unimaginable. It was a strange rehearsal, but a necessary one, because tomorrow, everything could change. That night, just before bed, Richard found Tasha sitting on the edge of her mattress, sketchbook in her lap. She was drawing herself and Sophie holding hands. Are you scared? He asked. She shrugged. A little, but not like before. Before what? Before I knew what it felt like to matter. Richard sat beside her. You always mattered. It just took the world too long to notice. She smiled. Thank you, for not giving up on me. I almost did, he admitted, but you didn't let me. She blinked. I didn't? You danced. She laughed softly. Keep dancing, Tasha, he said, standing, even when they're watching. She looked down at her drawing and added a sun in the corner. Then, in small letters, she wrote something across the bottom of the page. Home isn't where you sleep, it's where someone fights to keep you. The Whitehall estate had never felt quieter, not even during the worst months after the accident when the air was thick with grief, and the silence stretched for days. Now, the stillness was different. Tense. Expectant. Tasha stood in front of the mirror in the guest bedroom, wearing the pale yellow dress Sophie had picked out for her the night before. Her hair was neatly braided, her new shoes polished. She adjusted the collar nervously and whispered to her reflection, "I belong here. I belong here." Oh. Across the hall, Sophie sat in her chair, watching the garden. "She's gonna be fine," she told Mrs. Langford. "But I still wish I could go with her." Langford gently touched Sophie's shoulder. "She's not going in alone. She has all of us behind her." Downstairs, Richard was reviewing the checklist one last time. Documentation in order. Character letters printed. Tutor's report attached. Doctor's notes signed. On the top of the stack was the handwritten letter he'd written days earlier, now printed on Whitehall letterhead, with his signature scrawled in black ink across the bottom. At precisely 10 a.m., the intercom buzzed. "Sir?" The guard's voice came through. "Miss Porter and the observer have arrived." Richard took a steady breath. "Send them in." Elaine Porter entered first, dressed sharply in a charcoal gray suit, clipboard in hand. Behind her came a tall man in his early 60s, stoic, silver-haired, in a navy blazer and polished loafers. His name was Mr. Desmond Keller, a child welfare consultant and retired family court judge, known for his meticulous attention to detail and emotionless assessments. He offered Richard a short, polite nod. "Mr. Whitehall." "Judge Keller," Richard returned, shaking his hand. "Let's begin," Porter said. They were escorted into the sunroom, which had been carefully tidied. The sketchbooks were stacked, the crumbs swept. Everything smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh tulips. Tasha entered a moment later, hands clasped in front of her. She smiled politely, though her shoulders were drawn tight. Richard gave her a nod of reassurance. "Hi," she said, her voice soft. "Hello, Tasha," Miss Porter said, gesturing to a chair. "Please have a seat." Keller remained standing, flipping through the folder. "Can you tell us how you came to live here?" he asked without looking up. Tasha glanced at Richard, then answered. "I came through the hedge. I was just dancing." Sophie looked sad, and I wanted to make her smile. "Were you invited?" "No, sir." Keller raised an eyebrow. "So you entered without permission?" "Yes, sir," she said, fidgeting with her hands. "But I didn't take anything. I didn't mean to scare anybody." "And how long have you been living here now?" "About 2 weeks." Have you attended school before?" "Sometimes," she said. "But not the same one. We moved a lot. Have you ever been in foster care?" "I don't know," she whispered. "I've been in places, but nobody ever kept me." Keller paused, then looked up from his notes. "Do you want to stay here?" Tasha swallowed hard, her voice barely a breath. "Yes." "Why?" She sat up straighter. "Because I'm not scared here. Because they don't look at me like I'm a problem. Because Sophie makes me laugh, and Mr. Whitehall makes me feel safe." Keller studied hair, expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said finally. "Now, I'd like to speak with the others." Sophie was wheeled in next. She gave her answers clearly and confidently. "Tasha isn't like anyone else I've ever met," she said. "She makes me brave." "Brave?" Keller asked. "I used to be afraid to move, afraid to hope, but now, I'm not, and that's because of her." Darian was next. "She could have run away 100 times, he told them. But she stayed. She reads with Sophie. She cleans her own plate. She doesn't ask for anything. But she deserves everything." Finally, Richard was called back in. Keller closed the folder and set it down. "Mr. Whitehall, you have no legal relationship to this child. Why are you pursuing guardianship?" Richard looked him directly in the eyes. "Because she belongs here," he said. "Because she has done more good in this home than all the money I've ever spent. Because my daughter is healing in ways doctors said were impossible. Because I believe, in my soul, that this is where she was meant to be." Keller was quiet for a long moment. Then, without another word, he stood and walked out of the sunroom. Porter offered a small, tight smile. "We'll be in touch soon." That evening, the house was quiet again, but it wasn't the suffocating quiet of fear. It was the kind of silence that followed something sacred, something weighty. Tasha curled up on the couch beside Sophie, both of them wrapped in the same blanket. "Did I do okay?" she asked. "You did perfect," Sophie whispered. Upstairs, Richard stood in his study, staring at a photograph he hadn't looked at in years, his wife. holding baby Sophie, both laughing. He touched the edge of the frame and whispered, "I think you'd be proud." As he turned to leave, he passed Tasha's room. The door was open slightly, the light still on. Inside, she sat at her desk, sketching something slowly, carefully. He knocked gently. "Can I see?" She turned the page toward him. It was the garden. 3 figures stood together, one tall, one in a wheelchair, one with arms outstretched, mid-dance. And above them, written in careful, blocky letters, was a new title. "If they ask, tell them this is my home." 3 days had passed since the evaluation. No calls, no updates, just silence. Richard Whitehall didn't like silence. He was used to control, to action. When business negotiations stalled, he made them move. When markets fluctuated, he forecasted and adjusted. But this, waiting for someone else to decide the fate of a child he now considered his daughter, it left a sour taste in his mouth. He was in the study, pacing between the bookshelf and the window, when Darian came in holding a plain white envelope. "This came today. It was stuck in the side gate." Richard frowned. "No postmark?" "Nope, hand-delivered." He opened it slowly, expecting maybe another anonymous complaint, but what he found was worse. "People like her don't belong in homes like yours. You're not saving her. You're inviting trouble." No name, no signature, just the blunt cruelty of ignorance, typed in 12-point font. He read it twice, then a third time. Each word hit harder than the last. His hand trembled not with fear, but with fury. Darian noticed. "You okay?" Richard folded the paper carefully and set it aside. "We don't mention this to Tasha." Darian nodded. "Understood." That night, Richard